It's an honor to be here, a pleasure to be here. During the past 2 or 3 years of my life, I've done a lot of traveling. I don't know why, but I've just done a lot of traveling. I've been to Iran about 4 or 5 times. I've been to India. I've been to Mexico. I've been to Europe. And everywhere you go, you get into some type of conversation with somebody about something or other. And I just want to say that tonight we have a really high level of consciousness here. You know, I'm telling you from experience all over the world, the consciousness level here is high. And why is that important? Because as I said earlier this evening, everything flows from consciousness. Okay, you can't get there unless you're conscious of where you're going to go. So consciousness is in many ways the important thing. What I'm proposing here is the opposite of materialism. I'm saying that the thing that drives human history, the force that drives human history is consciousness and logos. And we know that God is logos and logos is God. And I talk about this. I talk about it in Iran, I talk about it in India, I talk about it all over the place, and you can see groups of people all over the world struggling with this consciousness. You know, India, if you read Hegel, is not famous for its level of consciousness. You know, the Logos never really penetrated into India. Iran, the Muslim world, they had their own problems. Ibn Rushd was confronted with both Aristotle and the Quran, and they contradicted each other. And what do you do when this happens? You know, well, Aristotle said the world is eternal. The Quran said it's created. What do? Well, Ibn Rushd said they're both right. And that's the end of Islamic philosophy. And you can't get along without a philosophy. And what you're seeing now is they have to return to it. The force of history is forcing these people to return to the Logos that Ibn Rushd abandoned 1,000 years ago. So I'm sitting in Tehran. The supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, gives an annual speech. I'm there at the speech. We're all sitting on carpets, you know, all of us in this big hall, chanting Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. And he gets up and he starts to talk. And he says, we're in a crisis right now. How do we know what the real Islam is? How can we tell the real Islam from American Islam? American Islam, American means bad if you're in Iran. That's what the word means. What does he mean by American Islam? ISIS, the people who cut out the guy's liver and then eat it on YouTube, and they photograph it on YouTube. Boko Haram in Nigeria, this type of thing. He says, how do we tell the real Islam from this counterfeit? And you know what the answer was? Reason. Logos. They are forced into this position. We're seeing a convergence all around the world right now because chaos causes a reaction, and the antidote to chaos is Logos. I don't care who you are. I don't care whether you're a Hindu or whether you're a Buddhist or whether you're an atheist or whatever you are a rational creature. And so when I stand in front of, I'm taken to this desert town that nobody ever heard of called Fazaa, near the hottest place on earth. And there are 500 Muslims, 500 Iranians sitting there. They've been waiting for hours because I was late getting there. I walk in and I'm stunned here. And there I am, and I sit up there and I'm thinking, if they wanted to, they could take me out and string me up from a lamppost, because there's nothing between them and me. And I was just in a march celebrating revolution in Iran, and we're all marching down the street, all these ladies in chadors. I'm dressed exactly like this. The only guy in Tehran wearing a tie. 3 million people, so 1.5 million ladies in chadors, and they're all chanting something, and it's not Allah Akbar, because I understand that. And so I turn to my interpreter, and I say, what are they saying? And he gets this funny look at us, and he says, death to America. As I said, I'm the only guy wearing a tie. It's a dead giveaway. You know, nobody in Iran wears a tie. And finally someone comes up to me and he says to me, are you an American? And at this point, I'm thinking, maybe Canadian. Would you I said, yes. I said, yes, I'm an American. He said, I would like to come to America. So this is the kind of ambivalence you have with a culture like that. This is the type of situation we're in right now, where these people who are chanting death to America are also being driven toward this common understanding of logos is now, and that's the consciousness we have right now. This is the moment. We have to speak to the moment, and we are in a particular moment. I've had conversations tonight with a lot of people. We know what's happening right now. We see the oligarchs who run this culture are drunk with power because they've gotten it their way for so long that they're not going to take any opposition. Who am I talking about here? I'm talking about a specific group of people, the combination of CEO and homosexual cabal that is now taking over one state after another. It began 1 year ago in Indiana when the governor passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This is a war on representative government. This is a war on what this country stands for. Okay? And it's being waged by the oligarchs who are pretending that it's about some type of right for other people, a discrimination, whatever it is. I wrote the book 20 years ago. Sexual liberation is always a form of political control. And now you're seeing it playing out before our eyes. What is going on in Georgia, right? Or what happened in Georgia? Okay? They come up with this is the people that the people of the state of Georgia elected. The CEOs and the homosexuals come in and say, no law unless we say it's okay. And the governor caves in because what? Because the NFL threatened him that they wouldn't have the Super Bowl. And now we're at North Carolina. And the governor signs it, and the same cabal of oligarchs, the same CEOs, homosexual combined, are trying to overthrow the government of North Carolina and now of Mississippi as well. This is what's happening in there. The Trump campaign, the Bernie Sanders and Trump winning in New Hampshire, for example, is a sign that the people understand that the oligarchs are running our country and they're running it into the ground. They have their hands on the steering wheel. The car is going over the cliff. And who's going to stop them? That's the moment that we're in right now. In some sense, we all have to address this issue because we're living right now. But on the other hand, we're all part of a bigger development, okay? And I've been asked to talk about a book that I wrote 24 years ago. I did not understand this 24 years ago. But in some sense or other, I had to write that book to get to the point where I do understand it 24 years ago. And in a sense, what I go through is, in a sense, what all of us have to go through. In other words, I couldn't get to Madison unless I got to Milwaukee first. That's a kind of crazy way to come here, but I'm bad on Wisconsin geography. So what I'm going to try and do tonight is, I've heard that a lot of you have read Dionysos Rising. You don't have to have me tell you the book. You already read the book. What I'd like to do is talk about what I learned since I wrote Dionysos Rising. What has happened since that time? First of all, in terms of music, and then also in terms of how music fits into everything else, because everything fits into everything else. And there's a sense in which I had to learn something about music before I could understand the way this world is running. So I'd like to talk about that tonight. So, May of 1988. May of 1988. I'm 40 years old. I'm attending a conference at Princeton University, and at this time in my life, I am what the Germans would call stubenfähig. Stubenfähig, which means I was fit for polite company. Okay? I am no longer fit for polite company. That's why I'm here. One of the attendees at this conference was the Canadian writer Anne Rosh Muggeridge, the late Anne Rosh Muggeridge, who was the daughter-in-law of Malcolm Muggeridge, the famous journalist, the guy who did the film on Mother Teresa. And she had been reading Fidelity magazine. And Fidelity magazine, I had been running articles, a series of articles about the relationship between the moral law and the intellectual life. And so I did a profile of Margaret Mead. And what I found was that there are two alternatives. Either you subordinate the moral law, you subordinate your desires to the moral law, or you subordinate the moral law to your desires. And what all of these moderns had in common was that they subordinated the moral law to their desires. And so she read this, and it was published as Degenerate Moderns. There are copies over there. And it kind of got a lot of press. I should have been hit by a truck at that point. And they probably would have made statues to me or something like that. But anyway, life goes on, and I'm in Princeton, and she says to me, why don't you do something on music? And suddenly I thought, yeah, that's possible. Why don't I do something on music? Because in a sense, it's the same thing. Why? And I thought, well, I'll do something on modern music. And so therefore I thought, who is the father of modern music? And of course, it's Arnold Schoenberg. But it's not Arnold Schoenberg. Everybody thinks it's Arnold Schoenberg, but it's not. And so this led to me into more and more research and so on and so forth until I started listening to Schoenberg's music. And I realized he's not the father of music, modern music. Richard Wagner, I realized, was the father of modern music. This is kind of pre-modern, if you're going to talk about this before the 20th century. Why is he? Because when you read, if you listen to a piece like Schoenberg's most famous piece, Verklärte Nacht, you realize it's Tristan. And at this point, you realize that Tristan is, in a sense, the beginning of modern music, for reasons I go into in Dionysos Rising. Okay? I got in trouble. I always get in trouble because of what I figure out. So one of the things that I started to talk about in this book, this is how these ideas ramify. It's not that you don't agree with what you wrote. It's just that suddenly you see connections to things that you didn't write. And so I started talking about the fact that Schoenberg was a Jew and that his animus was this Jewish animus against Western music because of what happened to him. He succumbed to sexual liberation. His wife had an affair. He was deeply wounded by the affair, and he turned for revenge. And he became a kind of Shylock figure. You know, he's going to take revenge on the Christian because of the Christian insult to his thing. Now, that eventually led to the book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. And if there's one book that got me in a lot of trouble, it was The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Okay? But that's then. Okay? And so it was following Wagner along this line through Schoenberg. And at this point, I started to wonder about my personal development here in terms of music. In terms of growing up, I had no musical training whatsoever. That will become apparent when I play the guitar tonight. My education, like most people's education at this point, came from listening to records and listening to the radio. And in many ways, it was the radio that became my education. I went to a prep school in Philadelphia, and that meant getting in the car and driving. And so for 4 years, I listened to AM radio, and I know every single tune that was played on the radio from 1962 to 1966. And this became the basis of who I am as a person in terms of music. Now, it's not great, but it is what it is. And in a sense, we are all what we are. We come from a particular place. We have a particular kind of background, and that's what this was. I also used to go to dances. And if you didn't grow up in Philadelphia in this period of time, you don't understand how important dancing was. You couldn't pass on your DNA to the next generation unless you knew how to dance in Philadelphia. That's why we had the collapse of the birth rate in Philadelphia. There was actually a song at this time called Do you love me now that I can dance? I'm not making that up. You've heard this song. There's an actual song called that, okay? And that was the way it was in Philadelphia. So there were dances and there were disc jockeys. And so in addition to listening to AM radio, I listened to a disc jockey by the name of Jerry Blavat. No one has ever heard of Jerry Blavat outside of Philadelphia. Jerry Blavat was a unique kind of combination. His father was Jewish and his mother was Italian. And that is precisely the crisis in music that was about to take place in Philadelphia. But I'll get into that later. I want to build up the suspense here. If you're interested in a cultural artifact about Jerry Blavat, and I know everyone in this room is interested in that, there is a movie that you can get on YouTube, and the movie is called The In Crowd. And you have to type in The In Crowd 1980, and this will be a movie about it's set in Philadelphia and Wildwood, New Jersey in the year 1965. Now, Wildwood, New Jersey is familiar to this man back here. He knows he grew up in New Jersey. Wildwood, New Jersey was the Irish Riviera. My Irish grandfather built a house in Wildwood, New Jersey, and we spent the summers there. And basically all the proletarian Catholics would go there for their summer vacation. And so they'd go there and they'd have these dances. Now, if you're not my age, you don't know what this was like because you can't recapture it because I've been back to the shore many times. But when you walked onto the boardwalk in Wildwood, New Jersey at this time, you saw miles of 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds or 9. You have no understanding. This was the baby boom up close. I mean, up front and ugly, right there in your face. All of these 18-year-olds, all these people milling around, and they all went to dances, and they all went to basically Jerry Blavat's dance. So this movie is about that. It's about that time, but it has this ethnic flavor to it that is I think the movie is afraid of itself because the ethnic character is so, explosive in this thing. So it's about a Jewish kid. He went to Cheltenham High School. They don't name Cheltenham High School, but that's where he went. And the most famous graduate of Cheltenham High School he's my age. He and I went to high school a mile apart for those 4 years in the 60s, and his name is Benjamin Netanyahu. Went to high school in Philadelphia when I was there. My life, if you want to put me geographically and all, I lived halfway between Benjamin Netanyahu and Sylvester Stallone. which explains why I'm so screwed up. Why I'm no longer stubenfähig. Anyway, so the Jewish kid watches the TV show, which is based on Bandstand. You remember Bandstand? So basically all these teenagers from basically Catholic teenagers go there and they're dancing, and it's all the latest dance craze. Now, the Jews didn't do this. They were not known for dancing. And so there is this Jewish kid watching television, just falling in love with all these Catholic girls dancing, doing all these latest dance craze. So what he does, this is the movie, so what he does is he starts learning to dance by watching television. And so he learns all the dance crazes, and eventually, by some fluke of fate or Allah's will, he ends up actually on Bandstand, and he actually is there dancing with the shiksa of his dreams, the blonde girl from Cardinal Doherty High School. Do you know what? How many people know what a shiksa is? Okay, it's the Jewish word for a non-Jewish woman. So he's there dancing with the girl of this beautiful blonde girl from Cardinal Doherty, which at that time was the biggest Catholic high school in the world. It now doesn't exist. And there's a story there that I could tell you. But anyway, he's dancing with the Catholic girl. They have this romance. It's happening. He takes her to his family, and suddenly he realizes this is going nowhere because the family thinks she's stupid. Catholics are stupid, aren't they? The Jews are smart, Catholics are stupid. So it goes nowhere. They break up. Now the subplot here is there's a Jewish girl next door, and she's in love with the guy, and he has no time for her, okay? still has no time for her. So he's feeling down. What do you do when you feel down? You think about dancing. So he turns on the TV, and this time turns on it to the bandstand. Bandstand isn't on TV anymore. Okay? It's been replaced by some lame-ass folk music show called Hootenanny. This is one of the great musical traditions in American history. This is what's happening here. At this moment in the movie, the Jewish girlfriend from next door comes over, dressed up like the hippie chick now. She's got a headband on. She's wearing fringe on her. And she shows him the great new cultural totem. It's a Bob Dylan album. This is the moment when Jewish folk music killed Italian doo-wop. You're looking at me. You don't understand the significance of it. It's clear.
I'm trying to follow this.
It's clear.
I'm with you.
This was a crucial turning point in the cultural development of the 1960s. You've probably all heard about Bob Dylan and the whole concert at the Newport Folk Festival when he played with amplified instruments. That's what's going on here. That's what there was. To get back to Dionysos Rising or Plato, when they changed the musical modes, there's going to be a change. There's going to be a revolution in politics, and that is precisely what happened. What you saw here was the change of the guard in Philadelphia at a time when nobody knew about it, because what you're seeing is, what was those baby boomers? All those people, the political expression would be John F. Kennedy becoming elected president, and then suddenly this man is killed, and suddenly we have a revolution, and suddenly there's a whole new order that comes into existence at this point. That's what happened. I didn't know what was happening. Nobody knew what was happening. But it happened in music. And so I'm going to play the guitar now. I'm going to play the short version of Tristan and Isolde. It only lasts 3 hours. Great. Whoa. I didn't do it. Don't blame me. So this is the cultural artifact here is going to be Jewish doo-wop. A crucial transitional moment. You may know this song.
Where's the microphone?
Yeah, just put it so you can hear me.
No, where's the dance floor?
Easy, Jim.
You can dance to this if you like. No, we're not doing Tonight you're mine completely, to give your love so sweetly. Tonight the light of love is in your eyes. But will you love me tomorrow? Thank you. That is Jewish doo-wop.
Thank you. I'll never forget it.
Why do I say this is Jewish doo-wop? Okay? First of all, what is doo-wop? This is ground zero of my musical education. Okay? Doo-wop is C, A minor, F, G. It's just like heaven being here with you. You're like an angel, too good to be true. Because I love you, I do. Angel baby, that guy's crying back there. My angel baby. Woo, I love you. Woo, I do. We need the contratenor here for this one. You know this is Angel Baby. This is straight up doo-wop. And this was done by Rosie and the Originals. And Rosie was a Mexican. But it was just straight, it's like the straight doo-wop. Carole King wrote Will You Love Me Tomorrow. Carole King went on to be famous in the 70s as her own act. But it had this kind of Jewish sophistication to it. Okay? The minor chords, other minor chords other than A minor and so on and so forth. So it was taking it to a new level. In spite of what I did to it, I think it's a really great song. It's just one of those songs that is what it is. I think it was great, and we listened to it in 1961. Okay, and that was what it was like growing up in Philadelphia. You would dance, go to a dance, and they play Angel Baby, and you dance too close to the girl, and someone come and separate you. And then it was called grinding.
Back then?
Which was kind of the 60s version of twerking.
Dirty dancing?
And you got in trouble if you did it. Okay. The Shirelles released Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow in 1961. September of 1961, Ron Radish came to Madison, Wisconsin, where he hoped to earn a degree in history under the direction of William Appleton Williams, a man he described as an authentic American radical. Ron Radish was a Jewish communist from New York City. Why did he come to Madison, Wisconsin? He came because the Communist Party had decided they were going to take over the University of Wisconsin. If you want to read the full story, or my story is in The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. The full story is in a memoir he wrote called Commies. Radish is now a friend of David Horowitz. He is now what you would call a neoconservative, which I say is just another form of Jewish revolutionary activity. If you remember, the famous founder of neoconservatism was Irving Kristol, and Irving Kristol came from the community college in New York City, where Alcove B was Trotskyite and Alcove A was communist. Okay, this is the milieu that he comes from. The Communist Party at this point decided we're going to take over the Wisconsin in Madison. Okay, so Wagner took part in the Revolution of 1848, and that was the revolution which gave us Tristan und Isolde and the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin, again, in the Jewish revolutionary spirit, I have the story of Ottilie Assing. Ottilie Assing was a Jewish German lady who was Frederick Douglass's girlfriend. He had a mistress. This is who she was. And she came to the state of Wisconsin in the 1850s. And she said she didn't speak one word of English the entire time she was here. She spoke German the whole time. Okay? Because everyone had come over. The failed revolution of 1848 had sent a huge wave of German immigrants over here, and they all came to the state of Wisconsin. As Bernie Sanders showed last week, Wisconsin never lost its socialist revolutionary roots. 50 years ago, Wisconsin was a magnet for revolutionary Jews from New York City like Ron Radish. On a slightly personal note here, remember, this is about me. When I get into arguments with my children, I say, this isn't about me. But this is about me. Anyway, there was the man who was held responsible for blowing up the ROTC building, which was the culmination of the revolutionary activity here, was a Philadelphia guy by the name of Leo Burt. Leo Burt has the distinction of having been on the FBI's most wanted list for more than any person in the history of the United States. Leo Burt was a Catholic boy from Philadelphia who was a rower, and I was a rower in Philadelphia too. Okay? If you want my honest opinion, I don't think Leo Burt did it. I think he was an FBI agent provocateur because Catholics gravitated to the FBI every bit as much as Jews gravitated to the Communist Party. Not long after the Radishes settled into their one-room apartment in Madison, a very thin young kid with traces of baby fat on his showed up at their door looking for a place to stay. That young kid was none other than Bob Dylan, who had gotten Radish's name and address from Carl Granich, who was the son of Mike Gold. Mike Gold is the communist who was the author of Jews Without Money. Bob Dylan and Ron Radish were part of the same network of communist Jewish folk singing coffee houses of the Greenwich Village rambling, gambling, long way from home culture and political revolutionaries who were just coming of age and wondering how to make their mark on the world. The one thing they had in common, other than the above-mentioned characteristics, was a desire to subvert what they considered fascist America. Dylan did not spend his night in the Radish's apartment. They sent him down the street to a guy named Danny Kalb, who was another Jewish folk singer from New York City, and he eventually created a group called the Blues Project. Where Bob Dylan spent the night was irrelevant, because when he arrived in Madison, he arrived in the equivalent of Bohemia, the Jewish revolutionary culture that had basically had outposts all over the United States. If you want another cinematic reference point, the Coen Brothers film about Llewellyn Davis, I think it's called something Llewellyn Davis, is about exactly this type of thing. Dylan wasn't a star then, but Ron Radish was. He sang something called Talkin' Un-American Blues, which attacked the House Un-American Activities Committee. Dylan was singing Woody Guthrie songs at this point. Woody Guthrie was still alive at that point. He became one of the most famous interpreters of Woody Guthrie, another being Ramblin' Jack Elliott. But he also landed here in the middle of a kind of musical conflict that had been going on for about 30 years at this time. The same guy, Mike Gold, that I mentioned, got into an argument in The Masses, the communist magazine, about the true nature of American music. He was praising a couple called Ray and Lita Orville, saying that they had the true ring of American balladry. Okay? He got into an argument with a man by the name of Charles Seeger, who was the father of Pete Seeger, who was the famous folk singer who was in the Weavers. Okay? Seeger did not like the idea of using American folk music as revolutionary music because he felt the music wasn't revolutionary. And that's how he got into the argument with Mike Gold. Really, Seeger wrote under the pseudonym of Sands. He said, really, Comrade Sands, this is what Gold wrote, I think you missed the point in terms of not understanding what revolutionary music is in the United States. It is sectarian and utopian to use Arnold Schoenberg or Stravinsky as a yardstick by which to measure class music. Which songs do the masses of America now sing? They sing Old Black Joe and the sentimental things concocted by Tin Pan Alley. In the South, they sing the old ballads. This is the reality, and to leap from that into Schoenberg seems to me a desertion of the masses. I think the composers collective has something to learn from Ray and Lita Orville. They write catchy tunes that many American workers can sing and like, and the words of their songs make revolution as intimate, as simple as Old Black Joe. We're talking about, in many ways, a variation on the theme I just talked about the conflict between the oligarchs and the people. Here we have the oligarchs in terms of the Communist Party that is the leader of what's going to be the revolution. And here you have the American people. And we have two different kinds of music. And what we need to do is to kind of form, what they need to do is kind of form some type of musical vehicle for revolution. The revolution that I was describing was going to happen in the 60s. In 1946, the Communist Party created a magazine that was eventually called Sing Out, folk music magazine. By the 1950s, this magazine had 1,500 members in 32 states. The Communist Party in America, however, failed to see the significance of the folk song movement and the fact that within 15 years, the People's Song membership would create an underground network of the sort I just described. One of the typical responses to this folk music movement was the response of a man by the name of V.J. Jerome. He was the Communist Party, the head of the Communist Party in the United States, which took direct orders from the Soviet Union. He was also what Radosh called the most feared man in Hollywood. He had a control over the Jewish scriptwriters who were writing the scripts in Hollywood. This eventually came out in the House Un-American Affairs Committee, and this is the so-called story of the blacklist. These people were all fired, and then eventually were all brought back. Betty Sanders wrote a book about this, and she said that Jerome was fond of folk songs and intimately familiar with the culture and tradition of Eastern European Jews. He was a product of this, but when it came to American folk music, Jerome proved to be as inflexible and rigidly dogmatic on questions of doctrine as anyone in the communist movement. In other words, he had an idea of what music was like. He was a Russian. The Russians have a different kind of music than the Americans. Russia is a different culture. So what would he consider music? What kind of music are we talking about? Which is, name that tune. Moscow Nights, famous Russian tune. And the Jews came from Russia, so this is the idea that they had of what folk music was. that is?
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure is.
How's our musical historian?
There's 3 chords there.
Yep, you're right. It's folk music. We don't have a 4th chord anymore. That's by Mir bis du Shane.
Ah, right. Yeah.
By Mir bis du Shane. Da, 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 da. I wish I knew the words. But anyway, by Mir bis du Shane is Yiddish. It's a Yiddish song. It's German. Yiddish is German, okay? And this is a German song. A Yiddish song that became popular in a Yiddish music review that played on Broadway in the 1920s. It's finally, yeah, it's in that tradition. Okay. Now this is what Comrade Jerome would consider music. This is what he would consider music. It's not American. You've probably figured that out. It's in no way, shape, or form American. Okay. It's also kind of like jazz, because in a sense, if you played this in G minor is sort of on the way to a kind of jazz variation of kind of bending it into the blues. And so it naturally morphed into jazz groups playing it. They started playing this thing, and it turned out what we came up with was something called Jewish jazz. The first chord, as I said, which was by Mir bis du Shane, which appeared in a Yiddish musical in 1934, and then was picked up by the black musicians in Harlem and played in their jazz club. G minor was in many ways the blues variation of G, and so Yiddish Russian tunes naturally lent themselves to blues-inspired interpretations. Jewish jazz as a genre was first known as the Oriental Foxtrot, and it soon made its appearance in the repertoire of people like Duke Ellington and Fats Waller. The first known recording of this type was Yiddish Blues by Lieutenant Yosef Frankel. In the mid-1930s, Eddie Cantor had a sit called Lena from Palestine, which was based on a popular Romanian Bulgar known as Noch a Bissel, which means a little bit more. As the musicians from Harlem noticed, there was a connection between the Yiddish penchant for Jews, for G and F minor, and the blues, and the clarinet also became a crossover instrument. In 1939, Artie Shaw released a tune called The Chant, which was based on a connection between the St. James Infirmary blues and Kosher Colin Mazel Tov. The people who were involved in this thing were involved in a kind of cultural crisis. The crucial moment came in the 1930s. At this point, the Communist Party decided that they're going to send organizers down to the textile mills in the South. So they go down there, and at this point, the South, we're talking about a time just before, the South is still in a kind of primitive state, and that means they have their own music. And so they have this ethnic music that is completely different. And so they're exposed to it, and they like it. They like it. Now, it's not the type of music that they were used to. What type of music is it? Have you been to Jesus with his saving power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in his grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul-cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? When the bridegroom cometh, will your robes be white? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in his mansion bright? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? One bright morning when this life is over, I'll fly away to that land on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away. Yeah, I'll fly away. Oh, glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. Just a few more weary days and then I'll fly away to that land where joys will never end. I'll fly away. Yeah, I'll fly away. Oh, glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. Thank you. There's a land that is far, far away, and by faith we can see it afar, for the Father waits over the way and prepares us a dwelling place there in the sweet by and by. We shall walk on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall walk on that beautiful shore. We shall sing on that beautiful shore the melodious songs of the blessed, and our spirit shall sorrow no more. Not a sigh for the blessing of rest in the sweet by and by. We shall walk on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall walk on that beautiful shore. All right, I want you to sing now. In the sweet by and by, we shall walk on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall walk on that beautiful shore. Thank you. Thank you. Now, what did you notice about those three songs? They are not in a minor key, okay, for one thing, and they talk about Jesus. So we got two problems with the Jews from New York City here. Okay, how do we deal with this fact? And this is, in many ways, a revolutionary problem as well, because what you're doing is you're going down there and you're trying to mobilize these people so that they will become members of the Communist Party and then bring about revolution in the United States. That's your goal. How are you going to do this? Well, I'm talking about musically now. How are you going to do this? Well, what they came up with was, in many ways, the folk music that we learned in the 60s, which is kind of like a combination of all of these things. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man when I'm too young to die. When I'm too young to die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, Joe said the men they didn't kill, they went on to organize. They went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every town and mill where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. And that was the compromise. That was written during the 1930s. It is a serious song because it deals with a serious issue, namely labor, which is always serious, and it's a sympathetic understanding of the working man, and I think it's a great song. So it's kind of like a successful combination of the American folk tradition and the Jewish commies who wanted to take it over, and that's what it was. Now, it was powerful for a while, and then suddenly it wasn't powerful anymore because the music, the revolution came, and it wasn't the revolution the commies expected. Okay? When did the revolution come? Well, to take this as its indicator, Joan Baez appeared at Woodstock in 1969. From a personal note, I almost spent my honeymoon at Woodstock. If the sin is in the intention, I committed the sin of going to Woodstock. God saved me because I got stuck in a massive traffic jam. Watching the helicopters fly the drug overdoses out of the place, sitting there with my wife in my Volkswagen Beetle. And we ended up picking up two hippies from California. Not that we were hippies. Drove into New York City, drove through New York City, and so on and so forth. And I didn't get to go to Woodstock. Okay, so Joan Baez goes to Woodstock, and she stands up there and she plays that exact song. Completely inappropriate. This song does not work. It does not work at Woodstock. Who is the quintessential? What is the quintessential Woodstock song? Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner,
Yes.
stoned on LSD as the sun's coming up, or something Dionysian, or even like that was a kind of a joke, but Santana. Santana, in a sense, reworked music, and this was kind of Latin music, but it was kind of Latin music with a Dionysian sort of tinge to it. To have, as I've said this elsewhere, but to have Joan Baez sing Joe Hill, the Ballad of Joe Hill at Woodstock, is like asking Palestrina to be the opening act for a Led Zeppelin concert. It did not work. Okay? And the whole thing then collapsed. The whole scene collapsed. The revolution took place, and what you had was a Dionysian orgy that wrecked everything, including Bob Dylan and a lot of other people's lives. The culmination of that, if you want to know from my personal development, is horror. Horror. Do you remember the end of Dionysos Rising when Agave is there? You know the story of Dionysus. He's the king of Thebes. Dionysus arrives. The women abandon their looms and they go off and they're dancing naked on the mountainside. And the king captures Dionysus, and Dionysus, he says, now you're my captive. And then Dionysus says, no, you're my captive. And he says, well, what do you mean? And then Dionysus says, would you like to see the women dance naked on the mountainside? And the king says, yes, as a matter of fact, I would. So at this point, he says, all right, I'll take you up there, but you have to put on a dress. He was ahead of his time. It was like Bruce Jenner in ancient Greece. So Pentheus, who is the king of Thebes, puts on the dress, loses his authority completely by walking around as a woman, gets up there to the mountainside. Dionysus says, you can get a better view if you climb the tree. So he climbs the tree. The women see him. They tear him limb from limb when he comes down. And the last scene, this incredibly powerful scene, is Agave, his mother, is sitting there with his head in her lap. And then the father comes on. And the father says, what do you see? And she says, it's a trophy. It's a lion's head. And then he says again, what do you see? Again. And at this point, this is this archetypal moment that happened exactly in 1977 when everyone sobered up. The intoxication goes away, and she looks down. She realizes it's this head of her son. And then he says, what do you see? And she says, I see horror. I see suffering. I see grief. And that is the legacy of the sexual revolution. And he nailed it, 400 years before Christ. And nothing has changed. That's always going to be, when the intoxication wears off, you're going to see horror. And the fulfillment of that is horror movies, because it became literally the case. So Alien appears in 1979. And Alien is the movie about sex. Seems to be in a spaceship, but it's really about sex, because the guy goes down to the planet, and there's that famous scene. Something happens to the guy, something goes on his face. Actually, we don't really see this, but this monster inserts his penis down his throat, and then it falls off, and then he's eating, and suddenly we have the famous scene in Alien where the guy's hurt stomach explodes. That's sex after the sexual revolution. It's horrible. It's disgusting. It hurt me. It broke my heart. I got a venereal disease, but I'm still in favor of it. I'm still progressive. And that was the conflict. And so everybody went to see Alien, and they were relieved because someone was finally saying that sex was dangerous, which is the message of Halloween and all the slasher movies and so on and so forth. Okay? But that's still ahead of time. 1973, I go over to Germany, and at this point, I become a member of the Baader Meinhof gang. No, I'm not. Strike that. Don't say that. I become an English teacher, and then I become head of a band called Kistedane. And the guy in the band who has musical talent is named Heiner, and he goes on to become a composer, which is what he is today, leads choirs and so on and so forth. At this point, we were playing American music. I was a cultural hero because I was an American. That is no longer the case. People hate you now because you're an American, even in Germany. But then in 1973, you were cool if you just simply showed up. People say 90% of life is showing up. Well, you showed up as an American, you were a hero. I had the same experience in Poland in 1990 when people would come up and want to kiss my hand because I was an American. And that's kind of like the final culmination of this is being in Iran, where all the leaders are chanting death to America. That's the history of America in this period of time. Thanks largely to George Bush and the war in Iraq. We became the villains for the entire world because of their wretched excess. Okay? But anyway, 73, I'm there, and we're singing American music. I'm saying, why aren't we singing German music? We're here in Germany. Let's sing some German. No, we can't sing German music. So it was always this kind of American lyrics that always sounded kind of off, like German-speaking American, but it's not really colloquial American. I don't know what it is. So we would do covers of American songs, and he'd write American lyrics. And I always kept thinking, why? Why are we doing this? And I had this experience a little later there. I was staying with dear friends of mine, a couple that we knew. They would put us up at their house, and we were having a conversation out on their patio. And it was my wife and I, the Americans, the German couple, and then there was a guy who was from Bosnia and a woman who was Italian, that couple. And we're speaking German because we can't speak any other language. There's no other language that we all share. So in the middle of this conversation, the German lady says, Ich bin kein ich bin kein Deutscher, ich bin Europäer. Which means I'm not a German, I'm a European. And I thought, this brings out the worst in me when people say things like this. So I turned to her and I said, Dann sag doch auf Europäisch, wo ist der Bahnhof? Then tell me in Europe, then say in European, where's the train station? Well, you can't say it because there is no European. They tried that. It was called Esperanto, and it failed, okay? That's what they tried. So the simple point here is that you cannot be a European unless you're a German or a Frenchman or an Italian or a Russian or whatever. You know what I mean? Now, this has musical consequences. And this was what I discovered later. So 40 years after I'm in Germany, Irish music arrives in South Bend, Indiana. And suddenly I'm confronted for the first time in my life with genuine, full-blooded ethnic music. It's Irish. And I'm starting to get involved in folk music now. I mean, real folk music, not Jewish folk music, but real folk music. Not pop folk music, but real folk music. And I'm playing, and at this point, I read a book by Ralph Vaughan Williams, the English composer. 40 years before I was in Germany, he showed up at Bryn Mawr College, which is just outside of Philadelphia, and he gave a series of lectures which are collected as known as national music. What he means, natio is the Latin word for ethnos. Ethnos is the Greek word for the German word folk, and it means folk music. And his, I think, brilliant insight into classical music is that classical music is folk music. And he had this kind of brilliant insight. He says if you walked up and met Johann Sebastian Bach on the street, and you wanted to know where the train station was, you'd have to say, Wo ist der Bahnhof? In other words, you'd have to speak to him in German, and he would answer you in German. Every time he opened his musical mouth, he spoke musical German. That's what music is. Music is like a mountain, but it's a mountain in a particular place, in a country. And that country has its own culture, and that mountain, the base of that mountain is all of these tunes that people just hear because they're, let's say they're German. So you sing songs in the bar. Ein Prosit, der Gemütlichkeit, and then you drink your beer. That's part of German culture. You sing hymns in church, and Bach was part of a family that was the most musical family in Germany probably ever. And so he picked it up in a sophisticated fashion, and he took it to a level that no one has ever taken it to before. That's what classical music is. And so the analogy in Austria would be, of course, Mozart, who came from a sophisticated musical culture, a father who was a very adept musician, and he just it was like the last stage of the rocket that just shot him into outer space. And that was the achievement of Mozart. Everybody is like that. Everybody has a definite ethnic identity. And this was part of my awakening to understanding who I am, who we are. Okay? Because we are, in a sense, part of an ethnic group that is not easy to understand because you're an American, too. So, well, what am I? You know, I spent a week in Guadalajara with David Duke. Okay? We're in the same conference, and he's trying to convince me that I'm a white guy, and I'm trying to convince him that I'm not white. I said, David, I'm biracial. I'm German and Irish. It gives me a genetic predisposition to multiple personality disorder. This is like the classic Wisconsin ethnic group, like the most famous favorite son of Wisconsin, who is
McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy, of course. He was biracial just like me. That's not what it means to be have ethnic identity in America, because we all came from somewhere and we come over here, and the real theory of ethnic identity in America is called the triple melting pot, which I've talked about many times. But basically it says no matter what your country of origin, after you spend 3 generations here, your ethnic identity comes from your religion. And so our ethnic identity is Catholic. We are American Catholics. And the triple melting pot means Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And it means that America is just like Yugoslavia. Remember Yugoslavia? It had 3 ethnic groups based on 3 religions: Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, who were Orthodox Catholic and obviously Muslim. Okay? And Yugoslavia was, in a sense, an arena of cultural conflict between these 3 groups. And of course, that's exactly what America was. In many ways, the classic moment of ethnic conflict, from my point of view, was the 1930s. And the classic conflict was between the Catholics and the Jews over obscenity in movies. Okay, and if you remember this story, the WASP, the Protestants, had failed with the Hayes Commission. The Jews were determined to introduce obscenity and all of their subversive stuff into their movies, and the Catholics had to step up to the plate. 1929, the stock market crashes just after Hollywood takes out serious loans to finance the transition to talking pictures. The Jews are vulnerable, and they go to the head of Mr. Antonini, who's the head of the Bank of America, and he says, "I'm not going to lend you money anymore." There's a crisis. Cardinal Doherty of Philadelphia calls a boycott of Warner Brothers films, a boycott of all film, all theaters, movie theaters. And by 1933, Harry Warner is losing $100,000 of depression money in Philadelphia alone. And at this point, the Catholic bishops are ready to expand to Chicago, to every big city in the north. And this is doom for Hollywood. And they see the handwriting on the wall, and they capitulate, and they introduce the production code, which basically kept films, no nudity, no blasphemy, no promoting homosexuality, all the films we knew from 1934 up until 1965, when the Jews broke the code with a movie called The Pawnbroker. Okay? This was the theater of ethnic conflict in America. It was cultural conflict, and the Catholics succeeded because they had an identity. They knew who they were, which is the main thing, is you know that I am this, I belong to this group, and I do not belong to that group. And so as a result, the Catholics had unity, they had solidarity, and they defeated, and they held back the tide of obscenity and pornography in this country. That was obliterated in 1965 because we had the breakup of the production code, we had the end of the Second Vatican Council, and we had 50 years of Catholic-Jewish dialogue, which muddied the waters so that we couldn't understand that Hollywood was our enemy. That's what led us to the situation we're in today. But my point here is that ethnic identity is also a function of music, and that the music we need is ethnic music, because all music is in some sense ethnic. And drilling back to ground, to the bedrock, you come down to these tunes, okay? Now, the question is, we have Bach, we have Mozart, we have Tchaikovsky as kind of the summit of Russian music, you know what I mean? Where is Irish music? What happened to Irish music? Where's the Irish Bach? There is no Irish Bach. And why is there no Irish Bach? There's a one-word answer to this question, and it is England. Protestant England oppressed Ireland for centuries. And whenever the Irish would rise up, they'd enforce penal laws on them. And one of the penal laws was it was illegal for the Irish to own an instrument, a musical instrument. And so as a result, they had this huge patrimony of tunes, of melodies, okay, that they couldn't play on the instruments, so they hummed them. And they carried this tradition on until they got the instruments back by humming and memorizing these tunes. This shows you the courage, the cultural tenacity of the Irish people, okay, who are in deep trouble now, but that's another story. The next question is, where is the English Bach? Why don't we have an English Bach? And the answer to that question is, in many ways, the opposite, because the English by the 18th century, this is now Ralph Vaughan Williams' explanation, by the 18th century, the English were so rich from the Industrial Revolution and the usual way they get rich, which is piracy and theft, that they could hire their musicians. And who were the premier musicians in the 18th century? The Germans. And who was the premier import of the 18th century into England? Handel. Absolutely right. He was the court musician for the Duke of Brunswick, and he was brought over, and he is a genius. There is no question about it. It's one of the great moments. But the music, and the interesting thing is when he came over here and he did something like the water music or the fireworks music. Let's take the water music. The water music is incredibly infectious dance music, and it's based on English dance tunes, but it's a German interpreting these English dance tunes. The English, according to Ralph Vaughan Williams, got so habituated to hiring Germans that they couldn't make any music anymore. And so as a result, they were always trying to be Germans whenever they played classical music. And it didn't sound right. It's like the Kiss to Dane in the 70s where they're singing American lyrics and they don't quite sound right. This has implications in other areas as well. This is in many ways the story of ramification. It's my understanding of the intellectual life is a kind of ramification where you learn one thing and then that leads you to learn something else. And it starts like it comes from branches. The branches of the tree sort of spread out all over the place. And you begin to start realizing that there are things that connect other things and so on and so forth. And so it was the ethnicity in music that led me to understand the ethnicity in American culture and so on and so forth. Similar situation, and I'd like to segue here into, I know we're going to have a discussion, was the situation with Tolkien and the change that took place in my mind with regard to Wagner. If you read Dionysos Rising, you probably know I didn't like Tristan and Isolde, and I kind of shook my fist at the guy for being a sexual revolutionary. What happened when I was writing Baron Metal is that I listened to The Ring Cycle for the first time, and I listened to Das Rheingold, and it was an incredible experience. Now, it wasn't an experience like Tannhäuser, because I listened to Tannhäuser, and that melody, the Pilgrim Chorus in Tannhäuser, is just a powerful piece of music. It just stops you dead in your tracks. He could write a piece like that. This was the entire thing. The beginning of Rheingold is not like that. But what you have here is an incredible mythic presentation of the roots of capitalism. Das Rheingold is about capitalism. Why do I say that? What's it about? It's the beginning. You have the Rhine maidens, and they're swimming in the Rhine, and they're guarding the treasure, which is gold at the bottom of the Rhine. And Alberich shows up. Alberich is a Jew. Everybody knew that back then. Adorno said it. He was a Jew too. Everybody knew this. Who is the Jew that we're talking about here? What are we talking about? So Alberich goes to the Rhine maidens, and he wants to make love to the Rhine maidens, and they kind of lead him on, and then they ridicule him, and he's mortally wounded. He's kind of like Schoenberg at this point. And he vows revenge on them, and what's the revenge? He steals the gold. And the Rhine maidens don't know what happened, and the gold disappears. And what does he do after that? Takes the gold, and out of the gold he makes a ring. And this ring is the ring of power. This is the way you use gold to have power over everyone else. And he enslaves everyone. And so he's got all the dwarves working down in the basement there, making him richer and richer and richer. This is the story of capitalism, in particular capitalism in Germany. Who was Alberich? Who was Alberich? Meyer Amschel Rothschild. Why is he Alberich? Because he stole the gold. Napoleon is marching toward Germany. The princes know it's a looting operation. They got to get the gold out of the town. The prince of Hesse Castle takes his gold to to Rothschild. Rothschild sends it off to his son Nathan in London. In London, Nathan Rothschild, his son, bets the farm on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. And he makes a killing. And this is the beginning of the real Rothschild fortune. This is what Wagner's talking about in this thing. This is the same Wagner who was the failed revolutionary in the Revolution of 1848. Now he's coming to some type of understanding of what really happened here. What was the outcome of all of these revolutions? In 1890, Civiltà Cattolica, the official publication of the Vatican, issued a 3-part series on the Jewish question. They don't do this kind of stuff anymore. You probably figured that out. In this, the conclusion of this thing, this is one of those things where it's like listening to Tannhäuser for the first time. You come to this conclusion. What is the conclusion they came to? Any Christian country that abandons the laws that were instituted by a Christian king will end up being ruled by the Jews. Official magazine of the Vatican, 1890. What is he talking about? He's talking about France. In particular, the outcome of the French Revolution. The French Revolution overthrew the king, overthrew Christian culture. And what did they get? They got slavery. That's why they had the Revolution of 1848 in the first. Capitalism was a worse master than the French king. You know who agreed on this? Friedrich Engels and Bishop von Kettler both agreed that capitalism was the cause of the Revolution of 1848. That's the world that was created. That's the world that we're living in today. Today. Who do you think these oligarchs are? I know who they are. I went to Occupy Wall Street. You go to Occupy Wall Street, you heard all the news, Fox News, must be true, it's on Fox News. Fox News was saying they're shitting on the sidewalks. They're having sex in tents. Well, I didn't see any. I was hoping that I'd see that, but I didn't see it. I got there, and what did I see? What did I see? 20-year-olds, the age of my younger children, holding little signs. And the little sign said, I am $50,000 in debt, and all I can get is an unpaid internship. That's Occupy Wall Street. That is usury. That is the slavery that we have been condemned to. That is what Wagner was describing in Das Rheingold, and that's what I learned since I wrote Dionysos Rising. Thank you.